Poštovani gledatelji, čast mi je što u programu N1 televizije u serijalu Budućnost Europe mogu pozdraviti profesora Edvarda Besa s Europskog instituta za javnu administraciju u Maastrichtu. Professor Best, good evening and welcome to our program.
Good evening and thank you very much for having us on.
Thank you. We had a very, how to say, symbolic event last weekend. So it was more or less 30th anniversary of Maastricht Treaty. And in Maastricht, we had one of the last citizen gatherings in this framework called Conference on the Future of Europe. What did you pick up of that weekend and of what you heard from citizens and in these panels?
I found it an extremely interesting experience to observe, and also potentially a source for some optimism that there is now a new effort being genuinely made to provide fora which can be felt as meaningful. This is something we've been struggling with for years, in fact, for decades, certainly since Maastricht. And I think many of us hope, cautiously, realistically, that maybe now we're going to take new steps to address this major gap in the overall system of governance that we've been trying to put together since Maastricht, especially the attempt to link strengthening formal mechanisms of representative democracy through the European Parliament, through attempts to build in the national parliament, with a need to make individual citizens and stakeholders feel that they have some meaningful voice. And it's not obvious and it's not easy. And the process is not over. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was great to see and to talk to citizens as they came to the panel here in Maastricht, to listen to them discuss issues, some of which I doubt they would have been discussing otherwise. Mm-hmm. And above all, to be doing it in a transnational context, not interacting with Commission officials, but from people from other countries, from other backgrounds, to try and identify common concerns, which they could then try and slim down into recommendations that can be fed into the policy-making process. One concern that I would perhaps mention here is the question of expectations, because I think that it will be dangerous if those who were involved in talking about these ideas and recommendations feel that they should have them followed up immediately in reality, when this is, of course, very unlikely to be the case in many of these very sensitive and ambitious questions. And I very much hope that there will be a formula found when the politicians receive these, when the institutions receive these recommendations, that they are dealt with in a way which is receptive and sensitive and demonstrates that people are listening, while also explaining that this is only one more very fundamentally important dimension of this complex way of taking decisions at EU level.
You've mentioned several very, very interesting and important points. I'll start from the last one, decision-making, which from the eyes of the citizens looks very bureaucratic and complicated, but you've mentioned the word meaningfulness several times. You're a very distinguished expert in the field, many of your fields, but one is political aspects of EU integration. What we saw with pandemic were some kind of tendencies which were present there before in our democracy: mistrust in institutions, mistrust in politicians, mistrust in both national level and EU, let's call it regional decision-making process. Of course, I understand that this cannot be fast after the Conference on the Future of Europe, but what kind of democracy can we envisage for our future as our economy is changing and, you know, digital levels and our societies are changing?
Well, thank you. I think that the response to the pandemic is likely to prove as a sort of a turning point, but not an obvious one. I see that there are two parallel processes taking place, which I hope will converge into an improved quality of EU governance. The reactions to the COVID situation I don't see as identical with the issues about EU participation. They overlap. And I think that the the impact on public perceptions of the way in which the EU is helping to respond through the Recovery and Resilience Facility is going to be important. I'm not sure that every citizen is aware of the great significance of the decision to engage in collective borrowing for these funds and of how the EU institutions are now directly interacting with the member states in deciding on the priorities, in supporting implementation, in supervising a little bit how things are done. And I think this should open up new levels in the way in which we think about our system of multi-level governance and of accountability. And this again will bring us back to the issue of representative democracy and participatory democracy. The way in which we're dealing with these fundamental questions of economic and social life are not only to be dealt with by the Commission, the Council, and the Member States, but increasingly with national parliaments involved, with the national social partners involved, and with citizens. And that's where I hope we can see the meeting point. As we introduce new systems of multi-level interaction and accountability, if we can also introduce into the system of policy making these new ways of direct involvement with care. Perhaps I should emphasize the importance of words when we come to expectations. Sometimes these new initiatives, especially since the Lisbon Treaty, have been referred to as forms of direct democracy, which they're not. And I think they, forgive me, should not be. What they are trying to do is to engage people meaningfully, to pick up that word, in forms of discussion and input to processes which do not, in the end, depend on a citizen vote for their outcome. These are not referendums. I'm not a great fan of referendums, except in very specific cases. And I think the point was well made in the context of the conference, that whereas referendums may have their value in some cases, they're also rather divisive. Yes, as opposed to no. Whereas the kind of exercise that citizens are called upon to engage in here is, what do you agree on? So these efforts to build in through the citizens' initiatives, through citizens' assemblies, are meaningful ways, so long as the expectation is not of a specific instrumental result. It may not happen. Is that you are meaningfully participating in a process. Another important word which was discussed much in the conference at the weekend was deliberation. So direct, no, but deliberative, yes, to promote fora in which citizens can engage with each other and with experts. There were people there under the name of experts who were not there to steer people's thinking, but perhaps as fact checkers, to provide some explanations of things, and above all, to facilitate feedback. One-off thinking is usually not optimal. One needs to hear a response and then engage again. And these exercises have been experimented with across the world at different levels for decades. And one of the main conclusions is that you need this process of deliberation. It's a process of interaction, reflection, and rethinking, and trying to come to a new level of common understanding. Not, I'm afraid, the kind of voting online that one sees on social media, which is no substitute, either for representative democracy or for real deliberation. And I hope that that kind of process can then overlap with the new process that the pandemic has helped stimulate, and I hope contribute to new ways of doing things.
The ground theme of Maastricht gathering was Europe in the world. In terms of challenges that we face from the inside, we can talk about, different conversation going on within the EU, question of rule of law. You've mentioned new instrument that can maybe be a seed for something in the future. I don't know if it's a treaty change or not. You can say it better than I am. that's one part of the issues. And the other is this external dimension, which we see now, from Ukraine. We have EU-Africa summit this week also. So it's a question of geopolitics, of disinformation, of hybrid threats that are, entering democracy in the ways not envisaged before. We see our south, our east, our north neighborhood with Arctic being challenged in various ways, and the digital sphere, and energy in terms of our transition to climate neutral continent. So it's a huge burden of subjects out there. How can we, keep our heads clear and understand this context, not creating some kind of atrophy in our societies, with citizens being I don't know if I'm too bold to say driven insane with all of this going on?
Well, I think you're quite right that this is an overwhelming number of issues of a very complex and sometimes indeed somewhat alarming nature. Without wanting to go into too much detail about external action, the current situation does not entirely seem promising. In the Ukraine crisis, I'm sure you've talked about with others, is not putting the EU as such in a very prominent or relevant light. And that is, I think, worrying to many people who see the need to think of the EU as an international actor with some credibility. And what's happened in recent times is not entirely in that direction. When it comes to Africa and our other challenges more to the south and in the Mediterranean, again, we have much work to do. The Maastricht conference, the panel there was on EU in the world and on migration, which of course on a day-to-day basis is at least as much on people's agendas, especially in some member states, as what may be happening elsewhere. So the EU is trying, I think, to process, given the possibilities and pressures of the moment, and it doesn't always find it easy to do this quickly and clearly to people. All the more reason to try and promote structures in which citizens do feel that there's some kind of reliability, there's trustworthiness, that there is an entity there, the EU, which is doing its best as a complex entity, which is hampered in foreign policy by the unanimity requirement. And perhaps in anecdotal, I could say that in one of the groups I was observing, this was one of the main points. The recommendations from the conference was that in most points, unanimity should be replaced by qualified majority voting, except enlargements. But for all, I fear that's not going to happen in reality, but I think it does reflect a feeling of frustration that we can talk a lot, but when it comes to the difficult decisions and then doing something, we're falling a bit behind. I do think also at the moment there's a strong pressures building up within the union to try and overcome this. And this year, I think we're going to see some new initiatives pushing in the direction of a more coherent and effective external action. However, we have to wait and see how that plays out.
And for the end, concerning our internal action, we saw also this week this ruling of European Court of Justice concerning the rule of law. It was a huge debate in the construction of this new mechanism of recovery and resilience, and it is our fundamental as a union. Rule of law is something that is core of Europe and also core of our values. So how can we get out of this situation where some feel more equal or unequal, or some feel more entitled or not entitled to follow?
Well, equally difficult and painful. And I think that we are indeed touching at the moment on some of the very fundamental issues. Rule of law is one, and I personally, and I think I, like many, feel that we have now to follow through with an effective commitment to deal with clearly defined breaches or threats, possible breaches. The second point that goes with it is the question of solidarity, not just respecting the same values, but I think equally in people's minds is the issue of solidarity. It's not just the funds are equally available and you should do certain things to qualify, but these funds are a manifestation of solidarity, and solidarity needs to be expressed also vis-a-vis, to take a topical example, acceptance of migrants. If we're going to share our resources, we need to share our burdens fairly, and we need to share our risks. And I link it back again to the Recovery Resilience Facility, the idea that we are now sharing risks as well as burdens is essential to have a feeling of meaningful solidarity. This is going to be difficult because it's a very hard line to draw between diversity and unacceptable difference. And that, I think, is a deeper challenge that we're going to have to go on working on, because where is divergence from common standards acceptable, and where does the red line come by which we say that's a no-go?
Professor Best, thank you so much for really this deep and really meaningful thoughts that you share with us. I think we need more of this kind of analysis in our public spaces in Europe. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for asking me.